Some people think power is loud, obvious, impossible to miss. But the most dangerous kind of power is the one you underestimate. The sun hung high over the restricted checkpoint just outside Langley, the heat pressing down at nearly 90 degrees, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirror as a black SUV rolled to a controlled stop, and Naomi Carter stepped out with quiet precision, dressed in a simple navy blazer and carrying a hardshell case that looked ordinary enough to be ignored. Yet something about her presence made a few heads turn without them knowing why. And before she could take more than 3 steps, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Ma'am, stop right there." Officer Daniel Brooks approached with the kind of confidence that came from years of never being questioned, his badge catching the sunlight as he looked her up and down, not seeing who she was, only what he assumed she was. And Naomi paused, her expression calm, unreadable, the kind of calm that doesn't come from comfort but from control. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked evenly. But Brooks didn't answer her question, instead circling slightly as if inspecting a threat he had already decided was real. "We've had reports of unauthorized transport through this checkpoint," he said, his tone edged with suspicion. "I'm going to need you to open that case." And just like that, the air shifted, subtle but undeniable. The nearby guards went quieter, the distant hum of engines seemed to fade. And for a brief moment, Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the handle, not out of fear, but calculation, as if measuring something invisible. "That won't be necessary," she replied, her voice steady, not raised, not defensive, just certain, and that certainty irritated him more than resistance ever could. Brooks let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if he'd heard this before. "Yeah, that's not how this works," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "You don't get to decide what's necessary here." And around them, a few bystanders slowed, watching, sensing tension without understanding it, phones subtly lifting, curiosity sharpening into anticipation. And Naomi didn't move, didn't argue, didn't explain. She simply met his gaze, and in that silence, something flickered, something Brooks noticed but chose to ignore, because it didn't fit the story he had already written in his head. "Last chance," he said, his tone firmer now, reaching toward the case. "Open it, or I will." And for the first time, Naomi exhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for just a second before lifting again. Sharper now, heavier, carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Officer," she said quietly, "you're about to make a mistake you won't be able to undo." And somewhere in the distance, almost too faint to register, a radio crackled. The crackle of the radio did not sound urgent at first, just a faint interruption in the heavy stillness. But Naomi Carter heard it differently, her eyes shifting for a fraction of a second toward the source, as if she recognized a pattern no one else could hear, while Officer Daniel Brooks did not even glance at it. His focus locked entirely on the case in her hand, his confidence growing with every second she did not comply. "You hear that?" he said with a dry smile, misreading the moment. "Completely. That is what happens when people think they can walk through here without clearance." And he reached again, this time more assertive, his fingers brushing the edge of the case as the surrounding air seemed to tighten. The bystanders now fully engaged, a few steps closer, their whispers building into a low hum, phones raised higher, capturing every second of what they believed was just another routine stop, another person being corrected, another moment that would pass without consequence. But Naomi did not pull away. She did not resist. She simply released the handle slowly, deliberately, as if she had just made a decision that no one else understood yet. And for a brief second the case rested between them, neither fully his nor hers. And Brooks took that as a victory, a small confirmation of the authority he had never questioned. "That is better," he muttered, lifting it with a slight nod as though he had restored order. But the moment he did, the radio crackled. Again, louder this time, sharper, cutting through the noise around them, a voice breaking in with urgency that did not match the situation in front of him. "Checkpoint 7. Confirm status immediately." The tone carried something unfamiliar, not routine, not procedural, something closer to alarm, and Brooks frowned slightly, irritation replacing certainty as he reached for his own radio, pressing it with a firm thumb. "This is Officer Brooks. Situation under control," he said, his voice steady, controlled, But there was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that stretched just long enough to be noticed, just long enough for the people around to feel that something was shifting beneath the surface. And Naomi watched him quietly, her posture unchanged, her expression still calm. But now there was something else behind her eyes, not warning anymore, not even patience, but inevitability, like someone who had already seen how this would end. Repeat. The voice on the radio came back, sharper now. Who is the individual you have detained? And Brooks glanced at Naomi, almost annoyed by the question, as if the answer should have been obvious. Unidentified female, he replied, dismissive. Possible smuggling, non-compliant with inspection. And again there was silence, but this time it felt heavier, longer, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from realization, and somewhere beyond the checkpoint, just past the line of parked vehicles and security barriers, a low rumble began to rise, subtle at first, like distant thunder rolling across dry land, and Naomi shifted her gaze toward it, just slightly, as if acknowledging something that had finally arrived, while Brooks, still focused on proving himself right, snapped the case latches open with a firm motion, unaware that the moment he had been waiting for was not the one that would prove his authority, but the one that would take it away. The latches clicked open with a sharp metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have been, echoing just enough to draw every eye closer. And for a brief second, Officer Daniel Brooks leaned in with quiet satisfaction, expecting something obvious, something that would confirm every assumption he had already made. But instead what met him was not chaos, not anything illegal or careless, but order, precise and deliberate. The interior of the case lined with dark foam, each section cut with exact measurements, holding documents sealed in secure sleeves, devices with no visible labels, and a small metallic badge tucked neatly into a corner as if it had been waiting to be seen at exactly this moment. And Brooks hesitated, just slightly, the kind of hesitation that does not show on the surface, but interrupts the rhythm of certainty, his hand hovering over the contents as though unsure what he was actually looking at, while the low rumble from beyond the checkpoint grew louder now, no longer distant, engines approaching with controlled speed, synchronized, deliberate, and the people around began to shift, some lowering their phones, others stepping back instinctively, reacting to a change they could not yet explain. And Naomi Carter watched it all unfold without moving, her expression unchanged. But now there was no warning left in her eyes, only confirmation, as if the moment had finally aligned with what she had expected from the beginning. And Brooks cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the narrative. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, his voice firmer than he felt, lifting one of the sealed folders, but not opening it. Not yet. Because something about the weight of it told him this was no longer routine, and the radio in his hand crackled again, louder. Urgent now. "Officer Brooks, step away from the individual immediately," the voice said, no longer asking, no longer neutral. And this time the command carried authority that outranked assumption, that cut through ego like a line drawn in concrete. And Brooks froze for half a second, just long enough for doubt to slip in. But pride is a powerful thing, and he pressed the radio again, his tone defensive. "I have the situation under control," he insisted, though the words felt thinner now, less convincing even to himself. And then Naomi spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a calm that landed heavier than any command. "You were asked a question," she said, her eyes steady on him, "and you answered it wrong." And for the first time since this began, Brooks looked at her differently. Not fully understanding, but no longer completely certain, and the sound of engines reached the checkpoint, black vehicles pulling into view with precision that spoke of coordination, doors opening in near unison, figures stepping out in dark suits, moving with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating. And the energy in the air shifted completely, the kind of shift that does not need explanation because everyone feels it at the same time. And Brooks lowered the folder slowly, his grip tightening just slightly as he watched them approach, his authority still there, but no longer unquestioned, no longer absolute. And Naomi remained exactly where she was, hands free, posture composed, as if she had never been the one out of place, as if this entire scene had only been a delay and not a mistake. And just before the first of the approaching agents reached them, she spoke one more time, quiet, Precise. Now it is your turn to understand what you are holding. The first agent reached them without breaking stride, his presence cutting through the tension like a quiet command that did not need to be spoken twice. And everything about him signaled authority that did not come from a badge on display, but from something far more deeply recognized. His eyes moving briefly to Naomi Carter before settling on Officer Daniel Brooks. Not with anger, not with urgency, but with a controlled intensity that made the space around them feel smaller, more precise. "Step away from the case," he said, his voice even, measured, the kind of tone that carried weight without volume. And for the first time, Brooks did not respond immediately, his fingers still resting on the open edge, his mind catching up to a reality that no longer matched his assumptions. "I am handling an active situation," Brooks replied, though the words lacked the certainty they had held only moments ago. And the agent's gaze did not shift, did not blink. "No," he said simply. "You are interfering with a classified operation." And the word classified did not echo loudly, but it landed heavily, like a door closing somewhere behind. Brooks that he had not realized was open, and around them the other agents had already begun to move into position, not aggressively, not chaotically, but with quiet coordination, speaking in low voices, redirecting personnel, clearing space without creating panic, and the crowd that had gathered just minutes ago began to dissolve. Curiosity replaced by something closer to unease, phones lowering, conversations fading into silence, and Brooks finally let go of the case, his hand dropping slowly to his side as if the weight of it had changed. "I was following protocol," he said, his voice tightening slightly, searching for ground that no longer felt stable, and the lead agent nodded once, not dismissively, but without agreement. "Protocol requires recognition," he replied, his eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi. "And you failed to recognize who you were speaking to." And in that moment Brooks turned, really looking at her now, not through assumption, not through bias, but through the growing awareness that he had missed something fundamental. And Naomi met his gaze without expression, without triumph, just calm, unshaken presence, the kind that does not need to prove itself because it already exists. And the agent reached into the open case, retrieving the small metallic badge Brooks had hesitated to touch, holding it up just enough for him to see. The insignia catching the sunlight in a way that made it unmistakable, undeniable. "Naomi Carter," the agent said, his voice carrying just enough for those closest to hear. "Director, Black Site Operations." And the title did not need explanation, it did not need context, because the reaction it created was immediate, Brooks' posture stiffening, his breath catching slightly as the pieces fell into place all at once. The warnings, the calm, the certainty, none of it had been resistance, it had been patience. And the ground beneath his authority shifted completely, not violently, not dramatically, but decisively, like a switch that had already been flipped before he realized it was there. And Naomi stepped forward just slightly, reclaiming the space without force, her voice quiet but final. "You did not stop a threat today," she said, her eyes steady on his. "You delayed something you were never meant to control." And for a moment no one spoke, the air holding the weight of what had just been revealed. And somewhere behind them another voice came through the radio, confirming what was already clear: the operation had resumed, and Brooks stood there, no longer the center of the situation, no longer the one giving orders, but the one who had to understand exactly what had just happened. For a moment, the world did not move. It simply adjusted, like a lens snapping into focus after being blurred for too long. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt it before he could explain it. The subtle shift in how people looked at him, how the agents no longer acknowledged his presence as authority, but as an obstacle that had already been accounted for. And Naomi Carter did not raise her voice, did not demand anything. She simply extended her hand toward the case, and the lead agent returned it to her without hesitation, without question, as if it had never belonged to anyone else. And that single motion carried more power than anything Brooks had done in the last 10 minutes. Because it was not about control, it was about recognition, and Brooks swallowed slightly, his posture adjusting, trying to reclaim some sense of footing. "If there has been a misunderstanding," he began, choosing his words more carefully now. But Naomi did not interrupt him. She let him finish, which somehow made it harder, not easier. Then I was acting within my jurisdiction, he added, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. And Naomi nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the kind that does not validate, only confirms that the words were heard. Jurisdiction matters, she said calmly, securing the latches of the case with precise movements. But so does awareness. And she looked at him fully now, not with anger, not with superiority, but with a clarity that left no room for excuses. You saw what you expected to see, she continued, not what was actually in front of you. And Brooks held her gaze for a second before looking away, just slightly, as if something in her words had landed deeper than he wanted to admit. And around them the operation was already moving forward, agents communicating in low tones, vehicles repositioning, a flow that had resumed as if the interruption had already been filed away, documented, understood, and Naomi stepped past him, not brushing against him, not acknowledging him further, just continuing forward with the same quiet purpose she had arrived with. And that was the moment Brooks realized the situation had never been about stopping her. It had been about him, about the decision he made the second he saw her, the assumption that filled in every gap before facts had a chance to exist. And one of the agents paused briefly beside him, not hostile, not sympathetic, just matter of fact. You might want to review the report when this is over, he said, his tone neutral. It will explain what you missed, and Brooks nodded faintly, though he knew no report would capture the weight of what had just happened, because this was not just a procedural error, it was something quieter, something harder to file. And as Naomi reached the secured gate, it opened without delay, without question, and she walked through without looking back, the case in her hand, the operation continuing. And for the first time since he put on the badge that morning, Brooks stood still, not because he was told to, but because he no longer knew where he was supposed to stand. The gate closed behind Naomi Carter with a quiet finality that echoed louder in Officer Daniel Brooks' mind than any command that had been given. And for a few seconds he remained exactly where he was, the heat still pressing down, the same checkpoint, the same asphalt. Yet nothing felt the same anymore, because the authority he had relied on just minutes ago no longer fit the moment he was standing in. And around him the operation continued with seamless precision, agents moving in coordinated silence, vehicles repositioning, radios carrying low-controlled exchanges that no longer included him, as if he had been edited out of a system that had no use for uncertainty. And Brooks finally exhaled, slow and controlled, his hand brushing against his belt as though grounding himself in something familiar, something that still made sense, but even that felt different now, lighter, less certain. And he turned slightly, watching the secured gate where Naomi had disappeared, trying to reconcile the image he had first formed of her with the reality he had just witnessed. And the gap between those two versions was not small, it was absolute. And that realization sat heavier than any correction could, because it was not about what he did, it was about how quickly he decided who she was before knowing anything at all. And a faint echo of her words returned to him, not as a warning anymore, but as something clearer, something harder to ignore. You saw what you expected to see, not what was actually there. And Brooks shifted his weight, glancing around at the remaining personnel, noticing how no one was looking at him the same way, not with respect, not with defiance, but with a kind of neutral distance, as if he had become a detail already processed, already understood. And one of the junior officers nearby adjusted his stance, clearly unsure whether to approach or stay back. And Brooks gave a small nod, more to himself than anyone else, before finally stepping away from the exact spot where everything had shifted, his boots sounding slightly louder against the pavement than before, each step carrying the weight of something internal rather than external. And as he reached the edge of the checkpoint, the radio at his shoulder crackled once more. But this time the voice was not urgent, not commanding, just procedural, requesting confirmation, requesting documentation, the system returning to its rhythm. But Brooks did not respond immediately, because for the first time he was not thinking about protocol, not thinking about control. He was thinking about perception, about the moment where everything could have gone differently if he had paused, if he had asked instead of assumed, if he had listened instead of decided. And that kind of realization does not arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, reshaping everything that comes after it. And he reached for the radio slowly, pressing it with a steadier hand this time, Checkpoint 7, he said. His voice measured, no longer trying to dominate the situation. Situation resolved. And the words felt different now, not like a claim, but like a conclusion he had not written. And as the transmission ended, Brooks looked once more toward the closed gate, not expecting it to open, not expecting anything at all, just acknowledging that sometimes the most defining moments are the ones where nothing happens, except the truth becoming impossible to ignore. The checkpoint returned to motion, but not to normal, because normal implies nothing changed, and something had, even if it could not be seen on the surface, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt it in the way every sound now seemed more defined. The distant hum of engines, the soft static of radios, the measured footsteps of agents who did not rush, yet never wasted a second, and he stood near the edge of his assigned position, watching the flow continue without him at the center of it, realizing that control had never meant what he thought it did. Not here, not in a place where authority operated in layers he had not been trained to see. And a senior supervisor approached from behind, his expression neutral, his presence steady. "Walk with me," he said, not as a request, and Brooks followed without hesitation, the two moving along the perimeter of the checkpoint where the noise softened into something more contained, more deliberate, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough to let the weight of the situation settle, before the supervisor finally glanced at him. "Tell me what you saw," he said, his tone calm, not accusatory, but not forgiving either, and Brooks took a breath, slower this time, more careful. "I saw someone attempting to pass through without clear identification," he answered, choosing each word as if it mattered now in a way it had not before. And the supervisor nodded once. "And what did you assume?" he asked, and that question landed differently, because it did not ask about procedure, it asked about judgment, and Brooks hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "I assumed she was concealing something." And the supervisor stopped walking, turning slightly to face him, not sharply, not confrontational, just direct. "You assumed she did not belong," he corrected, and Brooks did not respond, because there was nothing to correct in return, and the supervisor continued. "There is a difference between enforcing rules and projecting conclusions," he said, his voice even. "One protects the system, the other distorts it." And Brooks felt that distinction settle in, not as criticism, but as clarity, the kind that does not raise its voice but changes how you hear everything else afterward. And they resumed walking, slower now. The conversation no longer about what had happened, but about what it meant, and in the distance the secured gate remained closed, unchanged, yet it carried a new significance, not as a barrier, but as a reminder, and Brooks glanced toward it one more time, not expecting anything to happen, just acknowledging that some lines are not visible until you cross them, and some lessons do not arrive as punishment, but as understanding. And as they reached the end of the perimeter, the supervisor spoke again, quieter this time. "The system does not fail when someone breaks a rule," he said. "It fails when someone forgets why the rule exists." And Brooks nodded, not out of agreement alone, but out of recognition, because for the first time that day, he understood that authority was not about control, it was about awareness, and without it, even the right action could lead to the wrong outcome. Inside the secured perimeter, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, insulated from the noise and assumptions left behind at the checkpoint. And Naomi Carter walked with steady purpose down a corridor lined with reinforced glass and muted lighting, her footsteps measured, unhurried, as if time itself adjusted to her pace rather than the other way around. And the case in her hand no longer drew attention here, because in this space it was not suspicious, it was expected. And as she approached a secured door, it opened before she reached it, recognition happening without words, without hesitation. And inside the room a small team stood already in motion, screens glowing with data, maps shifting in real time, voices low and precise, the kind of coordination that did not need explanation because everyone present understood the weight of what they were managing. And Naomi placed the case on the central table, her expression focused, her presence immediately shifting the energy in the room, not by force, but by alignment, as if everything had been waiting for her arrival to lock into place. "Status," she said, her voice calm but direct. And one of the analysts stepped forward, tablet in hand. "Delay confirmed at outer checkpoint," he replied. We rerouted Phase 2 to compensate. And Naomi nodded once, absorbing the information without visible reaction, though her eyes moved quickly across the data, catching details others might miss, connecting threads in silence. And for a brief second, the memory of the checkpoint flickered through her mind, not as frustration, not as anger, but as context. Another variable in a system that required constant adjustment, and she looked back at the team. We proceed. As planned, she said, her tone leaving no room for uncertainty. No further delays. And the room responded instantly, movements sharpening, voices tightening into clarity, the operation continuing not because it was unaffected, but because it was designed to adapt. And as Naomi secured the final latch on the case and slid it open once more, revealing the contents now in a space where they belonged, the significance of what she carried became clearer, not through explanation, but through reaction, the subtle shift in posture from those around her, the increased precision in their movements, the quiet understanding that what had almost been interrupted was never meant to be seen through the lens it had been placed under. And Naomi paused for a moment, just long enough to let the room settle into its rhythm, before speaking again, quieter this time. We do not control what happens outside these walls, she said, her gaze steady, but we control how it affects what happens inside them. And the words were not a correction, not a response to what had occurred, but a principle that guided everything they were doing. And as the screens updated, as the operation moved forward, the checkpoint became nothing more than a moment already processed, already understood, and Naomi Carter stood at the center of it all, not as someone who demanded control, but as someone who understood exactly when to use it, and exactly when not to. Back at the checkpoint, the rhythm had returned, but it was no longer the same rhythm, because once a moment like that happens, it leaves something behind, something quiet but persistent, and Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the monitoring station, reviewing the digital log on a tablet that now felt heavier in his hands than any equipment he carried earlier, each line of data precise, time-stamped, objective, yet none of it captured the part that mattered most, the part where assumption filled in the gaps before information had a chance to speak. And he scrolled slowly, not searching for mistakes in the system, but recognizing the one he had made within himself. And nearby, the junior officer from earlier approached again, more cautiously this time. "Sir, they are requesting a full incident report," he said, his voice steady but careful, and Brooks nodded, not looking up immediately. "I know," he replied, his tone quieter, more measured than before, and for a second he considered what that report would say, what it could say, because reports are designed to document actions, not intentions, and certainly not the assumptions that shape those actions. And he finally set the tablet down, looking out across the checkpoint, the same stretch of asphalt, the same vehicles moving through, but now each interaction felt different, more deliberate, as if he could see the invisible line between observation and judgment more clearly than he ever had. And the supervisor from earlier stood a few yards away, watching the flow without intervening, allowing the system to operate as it should. And Brooks walked toward him, his steps slower, not hesitant, but thoughtful. "I will file the report," Brooks said, stopping beside him. "But it will not explain everything." And the supervisor glanced at him briefly, not surprised, not concerned, just acknowledging. "It does not need to," he replied. "It only needs to reflect what happened." And Brooks nodded, understanding that what happened and what was understood were not always the same thing. And he looked once more toward the secured gate, still closed, still silent, yet now carrying a weight that extended beyond the physical barrier. And he spoke again, more quietly this time. "I saw a situation and I acted," he said. "But I did not see the person." And the supervisor did not respond immediately, letting the words settle, letting the meaning unfold without interruption. And after a moment he said, "Then you learned something most people do not," his voice calm, steady. "You learned that authority without awareness is just noise." And Brooks let that sit with him, not as criticism, but as something he would carry forward, something that would change how he approached the next moment. And the checkpoint continued to operate around them, vehicles passing, radios updating, the system moving as it always had. But for Brooks, the difference was no longer in the system, it was in how he chose to see it. And as he picked up the tablet again, preparing to write the report, He understood that the most important part would never be written, but it would be remembered, and that would be enough. Inside the operations room, the pace had sharpened into something almost invisible to an untrained eye, movements precise, voices measured, decisions made in seconds that would ripple far beyond the walls they stood within, and Naomi Carter remained at the center of it, not directing with force, but with clarity, her presence aligning every moving part into a single purpose. And as data continued to stream across the screens, one of the analysts paused, his fingers hovering above the console. For just a moment longer than usual. "We have a ripple from the delay," he said, his voice controlled but edged with concern, and Naomi turned slightly, her attention shifting without urgency. "Define ripple," she replied, and the analyst adjusted the display, highlighting a sequence of movements that had shifted out of their original timing, not dramatically, but enough to matter, enough to require recalibration. And Naomi studied it in silence, her eyes moving quickly, not reacting to the disruption, but understanding it, mapping its consequences before they could fully unfold. And for a brief moment the room held its breath, not because they feared the outcome, but because they knew the importance of her next decision. And then she spoke, calm and steady. "We do not correct the ripple," she said. "We absorb it." And the words seemed simple, but the meaning behind them shifted the entire approach. And the team responded instantly, adjusting their inputs, rerouting sequences, allowing the system to flex rather than force it back into alignment. And Naomi stepped closer to the central display, her reflection faintly visible against the shifting data, and for just a second, her mind returned to the checkpoint, not as a distraction, but as a variable now fully understood, and she recognized something in it that most would overlook, not the mistake itself, but the timing of it. The way it revealed a vulnerability not in the system, but in perception, and she turned back to the team. "From this point forward," she said, her voice low but precise, "we assume interference is not accidental." And the room absorbed that statement with immediate seriousness, not because it introduced fear, but because it introduced awareness, and every movement that followed became sharper, more deliberate, not rushed, but refined, and outside, beyond layers of security and silence. The checkpoint continued its routine, unaware that its brief disruption had already been integrated into something far larger, and Naomi remained still for a moment after the adjustments were made, her gaze steady, her posture composed, as if listening to something beneath the surface of the operation, something that could not be measured on any screen. And then, without raising her voice, she said, "We move forward." And the room did exactly that, not because they were told to, but because they trusted that forward, in her hands, always meant control, even when everything else seemed uncertain. The room did not celebrate progress, it measured it, quietly, precisely. And as the operation continued to unfold across layers of data and controlled movement, Naomi Carter stood still for a moment. Longer than usual, her eyes fixed on a single point on the central display where a sequence had just completed exactly as recalibrated, not perfectly, but intentionally. And that distinction mattered more than anyone outside that room would ever understand, because perfection assumes control over everything, while intention accounts for what cannot be controlled. And Naomi had built her authority not on forcing outcomes, but on understanding them before they fully formed. And one of the senior analysts stepped closer, his voice low. "Phase alignment confirmed," he said, and Naomi gave a slight nod, her focus already shifting beyond the immediate result. "Then we prepare for exposure," she replied, and the word exposure did not bring tension into the room. It brought precision, every screen adjusting, every movement refining. Because exposure was not about risk, it was about timing, about choosing the exact moment when something hidden becomes visible on purpose. And Naomi's gaze lifted slightly, not toward the screens, but beyond them, as if measuring something outside the room itself. And for a brief second, the memory of the checkpoint surfaced again, not as a disruption, but as a reference point, a moment where perception had failed and truth had remained unchanged. And she understood that the same principle applied here. What people see first is rarely what matters most, and she turned back to the team. "We do not rush visibility," she said, her voice calm but carrying weight. "We control when it becomes unavoidable." and the analyst responded without hesitation, adjusting parameters, refining sequences, ensuring that when the moment arrived, it would not need explanation, it would define itself, and outside the secured walls, time moved forward in ordinary ways, unaware of the exact second when everything inside this room would shift from hidden to undeniable. And Naomi stepped slightly to the side, giving space not because she needed to, but because she understood the flow of control, when to stand at the center and when to allow the system to carry itself. And the lead agent from earlier entered quietly, pausing just inside the doorway. External review has begun, he said, and Naomi did not look surprised, only prepared. Of course it has, she replied, her tone steady, because she had expected that the moment at the checkpoint would not end there, that it would ripple outward in ways that required attention, and she turned toward him fully now. Let them review, she said. There is nothing to hide when everything is already accounted for, and the agent nodded, understanding that this was not confidence without reason, it was certainty, built on structure, on awareness, on knowing exactly where every piece of the system stood. And as he stepped back out, the room continued its precise rhythm, no panic, no urgency, only controlled movement toward a moment that had already been decided long before anyone outside realized it existed. And Naomi Carter remained at the center of that quiet convergence, not waiting for control, but already holding it, even before anyone else could see it. The moment did not arrive with noise, it arrived with alignment, subtle at first, almost invisible, as every screen in the room shifted in unison, data streams converging into a single clear pattern that no longer required interpretation, only acknowledgement. And Naomi Carter saw it before anyone spoke, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if this exact outcome had already existed in her mind long before it appeared on the display. And one by one the analysts leaned forward, their movements synchronized not by instruction, but by instinct. Exposure window confirmed, one of them said, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a weight that filled the room. And Naomi stepped closer, her reflection merging briefly with the data as she studied the final alignment. Every variable accounted for, every adjustment absorbed. Even the delay at the checkpoint now visible as nothing more than a minor deviation within a system designed to adapt. And she placed her hand lightly on the edge of the console, grounding the moment not in urgency, but in certainty. Then we proceed, she said, her voice calm, unwavering. And with that, the operation crossed from preparation into execution, not through a dramatic shift, but through a quiet transition that only those inside the room could truly feel, because nothing outward changed, and yet everything had already moved forward. And outside, beyond the secured walls, signals began to ripple outward, controlled, intentional, each one landing exactly where it was meant to, revealing what needed to be seen without exposing more than necessary. And inside the room, no one celebrated, no one paused. They simply continued, adjusting, monitoring, ensuring that the flow remained intact. And Naomi remained still for a moment longer, her gaze steady, her posture composed, as if listening to the silence between movements, the space where decisions had already been made and outcomes were simply catching up. And the lead agent re-entered quietly, his expression unchanged but his tone carrying a subtle shift. External channels are responding, he said, and Naomi nodded once, not asking for details, because she already understood the significance, not of the response itself, but of the timing. And she turned slightly, looking across the room, not at any one person, but at the system as a whole. This is where most operations lose control, she said, her voice low but clear. Not when they begin, but when they are seen. And the words settled into the room like a quiet reminder, not of risk, but of discipline. And she continued, we do not react to visibility, she added. We define it. And with that, she stepped back just enough to allow the system to carry forward without her at the center of every movement. Because control, in its highest form, does not need constant presence. It exists in the structure itself. And as the final sequences continued to unfold, seamless, precise, inevitable, the moment that had been hidden was now fully in motion, not as chaos, not as disruption, but as something far more powerful. something that did not need to announce itself to be understood, and Naomi Carter stood there, not watching it happen, but knowing that it already had. The operation did not end with a single moment. It dissolved into completion, each piece settling exactly where it was meant to be, until the room itself felt lighter, not because the weight was gone, but because it had been carried exactly as intended, and Naomi Carter stood quietly as the final confirmations appeared across the screens, each one precise, each one aligned, until there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to correct, only the quiet acknowledgement that what had been set in motion had reached its intended point without breaking its structure, and around her the team began to slow, not stopping, but transitioning, their movements shifting from execution to closure, documenting, securing, preparing for whatever came next, and Naomi did not rush that moment. She let it settle, understanding that endings, like beginnings, required space to be fully understood, and she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room, not inspecting, not evaluating, but recognizing each person, each role, each decision that had led to this exact outcome. And the lead agent stepped forward once more, his voice calm. "All channels stabilized," he said, and Naomi nodded, her expression unchanged, because stability was not the goal. It was the result of everything that came before it, and she reached for the case, closing it with the same deliberate precision she had shown at the beginning, the same quiet control that had never left her, even when the situation around her had shifted, and for a brief second, the image of the checkpoint returned. Again, not as a disruption, not as something unresolved, but as a contrast, a reminder of how easily perception can diverge from truth, and how quickly that divergence can define a moment. And she understood something that did not need to be spoken, that the system outside those walls would continue, that people like Officer Daniel Brooks would continue to make decisions, to interpret situations, to act on what they believed they saw, and that not every moment would end the way this one had. Not every misunderstanding would be corrected in time, and she stepped away from the console, the room now fully transitioned, the operation complete, but the meaning of it still unfolding beyond what could be measured, and she spoke, not loudly, not for effect, but with the quiet certainty that had defined every moment of her presence. "Power does not need to prove itself," she said, her voice steady. "It only needs to be recognized at the right time." And the words settled into the space, not as a conclusion, but as something that would carry forward, beyond this room, beyond this operation, into every moment where perception and truth would meet again. And as Naomi Carter walked toward the exit, the doors opening before her once more, the system continuing without interruption, there was no announcement, no visible marker of what had just happened, only the quiet reality that everything had shifted exactly as it was meant to. And somewhere outside, under the same sky, the same heat, the same checkpoint still standing, the lesson remained, unseen but undeniable, that the line between authority and understanding is not drawn by a badge, but by the ability to see what is truly in front of you, before it is too late.